I'm Julie Cooper. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and the director of the Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism and Racism. And I'm so excited to see all of you here for what I think is going to be an evening of intense and potentially even heated discussion about the important political challenges facing Jews in America today. This event is a co-production. It is sponsored by the Roth Institute, the institute that I direct, and it's also sponsored by the Center for the Study of the United States and our host, the Symbolista Synagogue and Jewish Heritage Center. So I want to begin by thanking the people who put in so much hard work to make this event happen. Yoav Fromer, the director of the Center for the Study of the United States, Omer Michaelis, our host and the director of the Symbolista Synagogue and Jewish Heritage Center, and a special thanks to two people who really did all the legwork to make this event happen. Hadar Dreiman, the event coordinator and public outreach manager of the Center for the Study of the United States, and Julia Levin, the administrative director of the Roth Center. And without all of their work, this would not have happened. So a huge thank you to Hadar and Julia. So we're really excited to have Franklin Foer here with us tonight. As many of you know, Frank is the former editor of The New Republic, and he is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He is the author of several books, but one I just want to mention one of them, which is relevant tonight, his book, The Last Politician, Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. And for those of you who are interested in Frank's thoughts on the Biden administration, there's an event tomorrow, which will take place at 12 noon in Gilman 282. And in that context of that event, Frank will discuss the Biden doctrine and the Middle East. But tonight we're going to focus less on the Biden doctrine and more on another topic that Frank has devoted a lot of energy to since October 7th. As some of you may know, in the past 14 months or so, Frank's reporting in The Atlantic has analyzed Israeli politics, American politics, and the often contentious intersection between Israeli and American politics. And the piece which arguably sparked the most intense debate and which provides the occasion for our symposium tonight is a piece which appeared in The Atlantic in March 2024 entitled "The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending." We added a question mark at the end of that sentence when we named the symposium because we're going to be debating it as a proposition. Has the golden age of American Jews ended? And this was an article that was disseminated widely. I sent it to many people sent it to me. It was, it circulated like wildfire. And I think there are at least two reasons why this article spoke to so many people and people felt the need to read it and talk and discuss it with their friends and colleagues. First, the provocative nature of the thesis that American Jewry constitutes a golden age within the annals of Jewish history, and that this idyllic period had come to an end. I think the second reason why this article became so resonant for people was that it articulated a sense, pervasive at least in some quarters, that something in the zeitgeist had shifted, with the result that many Jews felt increasingly alienated from the parties, organizations, and institutions that they had once considered their natural political homes. And the article didn't just give voice to this sentiment. I think that Frank also offered a political diagnosis that helped people make sense of this pervasive unease. Namely, he pointed to the crisis besetting the liberal order that has arguably shaped American and global politics since World War II. Now, of course, there have always been pronounced illiberal currents in American politics and culture, as the violent history of American racism attests. But without downplaying the constitutive role that racism has played in American history, I think it's not a stretch to say that liberalism in its different flavors, and when I say it's different flavors, I'm thinking, for example, of free market conservatism on the right and value pluralism on the left. These different flavors of liberalism have dominated the ideological landscape of American politics in the post-war period. But as Foer's article suggests, this is no longer the case. Liberalism is no longer the hegemonic or the default political language in America. Indeed, liberalism is subject to increasing challenge, and we're witnessing what I see, at least, as a pronounced ideological realignment, that the landscape of American politics is really shifting before our eyes. On the right, new forms of populism have contested free market ideals that once defined conservatism. And on the left, post-colonial critique threatens to sideline hitherto dominant forms of secular liberalism. And I think Frank's article makes a really important contribution to our attempts to think through and work through these ideological realignments. He forces us to rethink the nature of American Jewish politics in the wake of these ideological realignments, and I think arguably forces us also to rethink Israeli politics, since in the past 3 years at least, Israeli politics has been roiled by the same forces of populism, illiberal democracy, and democratic backsliding that we see in the United States. Now, again, American liberalism has never been a panacea, but American Jews, at least, managed to thrive in the liberal order, which granted Jews equal citizenship as individuals and religious liberty as a community, while navigating the trade-offs that liberalism requires. As the resurgence of anti-Semitism attests, however, post-liberal ideologies pose sharper dilemmas for American Jews. Frank offers an astute diagnosis of the task that confronts us today, the urgent need to rethink Jewish politics to address the challenges of a post-liberal and, unfortunately, arguably illiberal political period. I take Foer's article as a provocation in the best sense of that word, a generative provocation. And when I read the article, in addition to forwarding it to many of my friends, I immediately thought, I really want to discuss the conundrums that this article raises with scholars of American Judaism who can address the critical questions that are at the heart of Frank's thesis. Questions such as, how and when did we begin to conceive of America as a golden Medina? How was this self-conception of America shaped, cultivated, and sometimes critiqued by seminal works of Jewish literature and film? And if we accept that, at least in the self-conception of American Jewry, America has been experienced in part as a golden Medina, arguably a golden age, has that golden age come to an end? Is the current moment accurately described as a moment of historical and political rupture? And if we are at a moment of historical and political rupture, how can we move forward, developing new political strategies adequate to the daunting challenges of this moment? And so I'm delighted that Professor Hana Wirth-Nesher and Professor Eli Lederhendler, who I will introduce later on tonight, have agreed to join us, have accepted this invitation to help us think through this confounding and sometimes frightening moment in Jewish history. And now I'll turn the floor over to Frank. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for teasing out parts of my argument that I don't think I understood myself until that moment. Editors abhor question marks in headlines, and so we're stuck with having to go straight at it, perhaps in a very Israeli sort of way, where you just have to kind of, you just have to lay your cards out on the table and say something that is provocative. But it's so great to be here in Israel. I have cousins in the room, but it's also fascinating because there is this American Jews are from Mars and Israelis are from Venus quality to the way that we think about one another. And so part of what makes coming, I think to some extent, American Jews think of Israel as the safety valve, as like one of the places that they could go if Jewish history repeats itself and there ever is trouble. And I know Israelis think of America in the same sort of way. And so the fascination with American Jewry and the crisis that American Jewry is experiencing right now is something that Israelis don't just think of as something that's happening to members of their people in another place of the world. It's something that I think Israelis take very personally as well. And one of the ways in which we're interconnected is that Tel Aviv University itself has become subject, I don't know how closely anybody here follows this, but has been subject to some of the protests at Columbia University. Columbia, of course, is now the epicenter in many ways of kind of what's scary that's happening in the world. But one of the demands that protesters have at Columbia is that Columbia kill its joint degree program with Tel Aviv University, because Tel Aviv University is seen as being complicit with settler colonialism and everything that's terrible that's happening in Gaza. And so that's one of the places that has become a front line in a way. And Columbia, I just want to start with Columbia because it's, I think, a pretty good example of not what's happening at the core of American politics and the core of American Jewry. It's kind of an extreme example, but it's an example of an institution and its transformation in a way that I think is both a warning and somewhat reflective. And it's a very personal story for me because I was an undergraduate at Columbia University way back in the 1990s. And Columbia University, in a lot of ways, is a perfect capsule of American Jewish history. That Columbia was a place that in the beginning of the 20th century, to get into Columbia, you just had to pass an exam. This was true at Harvard and the other Ivy League universities. And so if you were the smart kid of a schmata dealer or some child of immigrants in Boston or in New York City, and you went to a good public school, your intelligence was all that it took to get you into a university. And so what happened by the time the 1920s rolled around is that these universities, Harvard and Columbia, were just brimming with Jews. There was about a quarter to a third of these universities were Jewish in the 1920s. And that posed a marketing problem to these universities because at Columbia, for instance, all of the Knickerbocker Protestant families didn't like the idea of sending their sons to an institution that was filled with these Jews with bad manners and who were perceived as being dirty. And so Columbia reinvented the whole process of getting admitted into college for the sake of excluding Jews. They invented the modern college application, which created such concepts as geographic diversity. So if you didn't want to have too many kids from New York City, because we know that what it means when you have a lot of kids from New York City, they looked to have kids who were well-rounded. So they wanted not just the people who scored highest on the test, they wanted athletes. And we know about Jewish, what they meant by that. They wanted to judge character. So they introduced the college essay, which is now the integral part of getting admitted to an American institution of higher education. And in fact, Columbia is fascinating because they created this indirect process for weeding out the Jews, and then they created actual quotas for the Jewish population that was the direct way of weeding out the Jews. And in order to deal with their surplus Jews, and to make money off of these Jewish students who they were rejecting on the basis of their ethnicity and religion, they created a whole shadow campus in Brooklyn called Seth Low Community College. And at Seth Low Community College, it was like basically 100% Jewish version of Columbia, where you had professors who were not the best professors teaching these kids. And in fact, Isaac Asimov, the great science fiction writer, attended Seth Low Community College, and which was to use the Yiddish term a shanda. And there's a funny story where the dean of Columbia college was sitting in his office talking to Isaac Asimov. And he said, listen, this is a great historical injustice that has been done to you. I want to offer you the Columbia degree that you actually deserved. And Asimov said, well, Columbia has a test that requires you to know how to swim before you graduate. And I don't know how to swim. And so the dean took a glass of water and threw it on Asimov and presented him with his degree. But by the time the 1960s roll around, everything in American life had been transformed. Once you fight a war against Adolf Hitler, it's impossible to plausibly continue to have your elite deny access to Jews. And so after World War II, you have anti-Semitism becomes verboten in polite society. I mean, it was still something that you would hear at three martini lunches at the country club, but it was not something that you could say in public discourse. You have a radical decline in the politicians who use anti-Semitism. One of the things that I think is always so striking to me about American life is that even as World War II was being fought, American anti-Semitism was a real palpable part of our national life, that you had politicians who were rabidly anti-Semitic in Congress. The 1940s followed this surge of anti-Semitism with Father Coughlin and his anti-Semitic radio addresses, and Charles Lindbergh making his anti-Semitic case against America's entry into World War II. Even as World War II was being fought, you still had street gangs and violence in New York City and Boston that was directed against Jews. But after World War II, things changed. America learned about the Shoah, and you had cultural changes that took place. You had the Gregory Peck movie, The Gentleman's Agreement, making the case against all of the polite anti-Semitism that was existing. America was redefined as a Judeo-Christian nation. The quotas at Ivy League institutions didn't fall straight away. Places like Yale and Harvard actually resisted the quotas disappearing. They argued against legislation in state legislatures that tried to erase religious discrimination and made the case that they could take care of their anti-Semitism problem on their own without any sort of governmental intervention. But by the time the 1960s happen, these institutions are transformed. That Yale in 1945 didn't have a single tenured Jewish professor. But by the time you get to the late 1960s, more than 17% of the professoriate at elite universities was Jewish. By the time you get to the late 1960s, I think estimates show that probably about a third of Columbia was Jewish again. And by the time that I went to Columbia, I was able to experience Jewish life in a way that felt far more pluralistic, far more open than any place I'd ever been. That when I lived in a dorm at Columbia, there were floors that had kosher kitchens. They were called anatefka, and it was possible to it felt like a thoroughly Jewish institution. In the 1990s, I never heard anybody criticize Israel on campus, and it was a campus where Edward Said was the star professor. It really felt as if kind of we'd made it. And so that was the 1990s. When I talk about the golden age of American Judaism, I mean, I think as a period, I'm talking about the entirety of the post-war era. But really, I think by the time you get to the 1990s, you hit this moment where we're being Jewish and anti-Semitism were not really questions in public life at all. In fact, if you listen to the sociologists describe it, the biggest problem afflicting Jews in the 1990s was that America loved us too much. that all of the Gentiles wanted to marry Jews and we would disappear because of intermarriage. And, there were cultural markers that, Seinfeld was the biggest television show on television, which Seinfeld calls itself a show about nothing. But really, it was like a show about New York Jews. There was Adam Sandler, the comedian, had his Hanukkah song, which was played on every single radio station, and even Gentiles knew the words to this song. I think if you ask a lot of Gentile kids who were my age, who went to public schools, they would know Hanukkah songs. They would know dreidel songs, because being Jewish and Christian were kind of treated, on a plane, and Jews were stitched into civic institutions and into rituals. The 1990s also happened to be this period where it felt as if the entire world was rolling into this paradise. Communism fell. Francis Fukuyama pronounced the end of history. And for American Jews, this was our version of the end of history. And then things started to change. And when I wrote this article, I had to wrestle with a couple facts. One was that I knew that there was a problem of anti-Semitism out there in America, but it wasn't really something that I had thought especially rigorously about, or I treated with an incredible amount of alarm. I thought of it mostly as a problem that existed on the American right, because I had seen Charlottesville in 2017. I had seen the tiki torches. We'd all heard the chants about Jews not replacing us. And I knew that there was a problem, that there was hatred of Israel was percolating on the American left. But I think part of what American Jewry thought, and I'm speaking kind of in a we about this, is that I think that there was this almost wishful thought that debates about Israel were self-contained, that they would never really spill over, that Israel is a subject that invokes incredible passion, and that it was never going to fully reverberate against American Jewry. The other thing that I think happens is that there is this polarization that happens in American society. I know you have extreme polarization within Israeli politics, but within American political life, everything is your team versus my team. That you think that your team is the side of the angels, and that the other team are the side of the devils. And it infects the way that we think. And there's this incredible reluctance within American political discourse to ever call out problems on your own political team. It's a form of intellectual dysfunction brought on by tribalism and by ideology. So I started to think, kind of, where did we begin to take this wrong turn? Where did American Jewish life cease to be this paradise that existed in the end of history? And I started to rewind the tape, to think about what had happened in the years, in the 21st century. And I went back to September 11th. And I thought, okay, on September 11th, it's really the first, anti-Semitism never disappeared from American life, but it felt like it existed on the fringes. When was the moment that it started to creep into the mainstream? Well, after September 11th, you started to hear some of these crank theorists talk about the ways in which Mossad had been responsible for the attacks on the World Trade Center. That felt like a crank version of events. That felt like the kooks talking. But after September 11th, you started to hear more respectable people blame the United States' alliance with Israel for its misadventures in the Middle East, which were then responsible for Osama bin Laden attacking the United States. And there was a more respectable version of this that started to ricochet, which was that it was the neoconservatives who were responsible for a dangerous turn in American foreign policy, where we became more adventuresome, where the dual loyalties of various intellectuals and various policymakers were taking American foreign policy in a dangerous sort of direction. And it was pretty obvious at the time that when people talked about neoconservatives, they would list off names, Bill Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, Paul Wolfowitz. You don't have to go to synagogue to be able to discern the pattern that people were getting at when they described that. And at the end of 2006, there was the Walt Mearsheimer book about the Israel lobby, which kind of spelled it out, which said that American foreign policy had been corrupted by essentially a cabal of Jewish lobbies, Jewish intellectuals who had dual loyalty to the United States and Israel, and had allowed that loyalty and allowed their influence to infect the system. Now, there was a lot of classical anti-Semitic tropes built into that analysis. The idea that there was this small group, this small cabal of Jews who were exerting power in a corrupt sort of way, using their money to disproportionately influence the American political system. That happens. And that book becomes a New York Times bestseller. And I think it's evidence of the fact that you start to have this creeping legitimacy for arguments that had once been taboo. But we're entering, after September 11th, an era of crisis, where there's just one crisis after another. You have the financial crisis, which follows September 11th, follows the Iraq War. And politicians, American politicians, were immaculately responsible in the way that they talked about the financial crisis. You can't go back and find American politicians blaming Bernie Madoff or blaming Lehman Brothers, which was a bank founded by Jewish cattle brokers in the South in the 19th century. Jews were not blamed in public discourse, but there's polling from that time. And the polling shows that there was a non-trivial part of the American people who blamed Jews for the financial crisis, because anti-Semitism is something that may have gotten shoved into a box. It may have been something that was not polite to discuss in public company, but it was something that was still there, sitting in minds, still part of the fabric of Western culture, still part of the fabric of America, and it starts to appear. Then we have another crisis. You have the flow of migrants across the southern border of the United States, and if you start to go back quite some time, you will see on Fox News and within right-wing media this attempt to pin blame for that on George Soros. Now, I know George Soros is a controversial figure, and not everybody loves him, but no matter what you think about George Soros, he does inhabit this very classical role of the shadowy Jewish financier who's pulling the strings. And the people who injected Soros into this debate in this sort of way may not have intentionally been doing it to exploit anti-Semitic feelings, but they were fomenting anti-Semitism when they did that. Simultaneous to all of this happening, simultaneous to these crises which are popping up. Wait, let me just pause for 1 second. COVID is another great example of a crisis that pops up where we don't think of it as being a flashpoint in the narrative of anti-Semitism, but it is a flashpoint in the narrative of anti-Semitism. The reason that in all of these instances you have Jews taking the blame is because big mysterious things are happening in society. It's very hard to explain the financial crisis. I would challenge half of this room to give me a one-sentence explanation of why we had a financial crisis in 2008. You take something like COVID, where society mysteriously shuts down in the face of an invisible virus, where experts and technocrats are making decisions that bring life to a grinding halt. It's the type of thing where you need to figure out how to make sense of it, and you want to blame someone. And so, we repeat this ancient cycle of Jews taking the blame. Simultaneous to all of this playing out, we have changes within the Middle East. So when I went to college in the 1990s, part of the reason that Israel was never vilified, Israel was never mentioned, is because there was a peace process. And it felt like coexistence was within grasp. And so there was no need to vilify Israel as a pariah if there was going to be this plausible scenario where there would be coexistence. But then we know what happens, where the peace process it shatters. You have the Durban Conference. You have a change within the way that the pro-Palestinian groups begin to approach their politicking, and they begin to define Israel as a racist entity. Of course, there's an old discourse about this, but it comes surging back. And you have the advent of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And one of the things that happens with BDS is that it is a deliberate attempt to paint with the broadest brush. Every person in this room, by way of the BDS standard, is somebody who is probably a pariah, who needs to be treated as a pariah. And that spilled over. When people talk about Israelis being a pariah, it's not a far leap for them to then think of the institutions in America that defend Israel and assert its right to exist as being pariah, and then the Jews who inhabit those institutions being a pariah. And so, we see this in the way on campuses that Hillel becomes an object of protest. Hillel aspires to be this consensus space within American universities where it's possible to have Shabbat dinner and celebrate holidays and find some sense of community. Hillel is a Zionistic organization, but Hillel is not defined by its politics. It's defined by its place within the community. And suddenly Hillel's become pariah. And this begins to infect the way that the American left behaves. I saw this with my own daughter, who is a member of the Sunrise Movement, which is the climate justice movement on the left. They played a very significant role in changing the politics around climate. But in Washington, D.C., where I lived, they made a decision that they wouldn't participate in a march on behalf of, it was on a fairly esoteric, specific issue, because there were Jewish women's groups who were participating in the march, and they didn't want to be members of a coalition with Zionists. So they were imposing religious tests on who they would get into, who they would engage in politics with. They were excluding, essentially forcing Jews to make a decision about where their allegiances lied. And this continues on American campuses. Just to return to Columbia briefly, we saw the encampments last year. The encampments have come and gone, and the encampments were just a flashpoint. Columbia produced a document that was commissioned by the president of the university and written. It was a task force that included some of the most eminent academics at Columbia University. And they studied the problem of anti-Semitism on campus. And what they found was something that predated October 7th. And what made it so dangerous and what made it so scary was that when they were describing the ways in which hatred of Israel had begun to infect student life. So essentially, there was this coalition last year called Columbia University Apartheid Divestment. It replaced Students for Justice in Palestine, which had been banned by the university. And Columbia, this group was the umbrella group for the protest. They had 106 student groups join their coalition. And it wasn't just a coalition in opposition to the war in Gaza. It was a coalition that very specifically and clearly celebrated martyrdom, that very clearly and specifically expressed solidarity with Hamas and Hezbollah. And the groups that joined in this coalition were not the International Socialist Organization and women's rights groups. They were the Barnard Gardening Club. They were the chess club. And so students, they were the dance club. Students needed to make a choice. They were being forced to decide, do I simply reject the fact that Israel, do I have to just shelve the fact that my religion, my sense of peoplehood, my sense of family gives me a set of commitments, or do I have to surrender those in order to do the most benign, basic parts of campus life? There is this attempt to sort the world into the good Jews who disavow Israel and into the bad Jews who defend its right to exist. And there is social pressure being applied on Jewish students in order to make that kind of choice. So these things are happening simultaneously on the left, on the right. On the left, there is this identity politics that is being practiced that divides the world into the oppressors and the oppressed. And it's very clear that Israel has come to be representative of the oppressors. You have the ways in which settler colonialism as an analysis of power has begun to infiltrate almost every single academic discipline. At Columbia, I've talked to people who go to the architecture school where they build physical buildings. You don't need to know anything about the Middle East, but there are settler colonialism is taught within the architecture school. If you go to the School of Public Health at Columbia, you see the ways in which it's become infected there. At the same time, this is happening on the intersectional left, where these choices are being forced on Jews. You have this happening on the right, where Donald Trump, the president of the United States, is having dinner at his club with a Holocaust denier. Elon Musk, who is the most powerful figure in the Trump administration, has his own history of blaming Jews for the migration crisis, for attacking the Anti-Defamation League, for being engineers of the collapse of American life. These two things are happening simultaneously. So I have a couple minutes left. I want to just pivot slightly. So what do I mean that the golden age of American Jewry is ending? I don't necessarily mean that we're returning to 1944. And I certainly don't mean that we're on a train to Auschwitz in the United States. The United States is still an incredible country. American Jewry has incredible strong institutions. American Jewry has incredibly strong political alliances. There's a lot on American Jews' side. We're an incredibly prosperous, incredibly creative, incredibly innovative community, and we've got a lot going for us. But what I do mean is that anti-Semitism, which had been taboo, is suddenly there. It has at least the tacit support of our current president, He seems willing to overlook the fact that a lot of his allies, some of his cabinet appointees, have said very anti-Semitic things. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said that COVID was engineered to protect Ashkenazi Jews. It's craziness. Matt Gaetz, who he nominated for Attorney General, invited a Holocaust denier to be his guest at the State of the Union. Donald Trump invited Kanye West to the Oval Office, despite every terrible thing Kanye West has said about Jews. Anti-Semitism is there in the open. Jews, the elite has just been transformed in ways that are pretty healthy for the United States in general. It's kind of, no group should have a right to be a third of the Ivy League. The elite is being re-engineered to reflect changing American demographics. It was kind of this incredible moment in American history where Jews had as much cultural cachet and as much cultural power as they did have in the post-war era. That was always bound to change at some point in time. But let me just say one hopeful thing, or two hopeful things. The first is that there are a considerable number of October 8th Jews in the United States who have reconnected with their identity in the aftermath of October 7th and who feel a sense of solidarity and a sense of peoplehood that they never had. I've seen this when I go to places like San Francisco, and I've seen parents who begin to organize because they see anti-Semitism starting to creep into their children's schools. And these are people who were generally disconnected from any sense of Jewishness before. And then the other thing that makes me optimistic is that if I look back on American Jewish history, one of the things that American Jews have done is that they've helped define the idea of American exceptionalism, that they helped take all of these latent, pluralistic, liberal instincts that were always there in the United States and to draw them out and to refashion America's identity. We see this in something like pop music, where people like Paul Simon and Bob Dylan and George Gershwin remade the American songbook in a way that was mongrel and hybrid, where they drew on different traditions and they integrated them all into a new way of thinking about the United States. You see this in politics, in political thinking, where these great intellectuals of the 1950s reconstituted our idea of what comprises the American identity to be a much more capacious idea of nationhood. And if I look at what American Jews need to do in the present, there's this strong instinct that they have to retreat, to become more tribal, to withdraw from American politics, to in fact make everything kind of about Israel and our relationship to Israel, as opposed to having that same sort of capacious, generative role that we had before. It feels to me like America has lost its way in very important senses, and that one of the things that American Jews can do, which they've done so many times in the past of American history, is they can read America's best self back to it. They can call it to be its best self. I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, especially for injecting that note of optimism. And so now we're going to have two responses, and after the responses, we're going to have time for questions and debate from you in the audience. And first, we're going to hear from Professor Hana Wirth-Nesher, who is Professor Emerita of English and American Studies here at Tel Aviv University, where she served as the Samuel L. and Perry Haber Chair on the Study of the Jewish American Experience. She was also the founding director of the Goldreich Institute for the Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture, And both of our speakers have published many books, but I'm only going to mention two publications which are relevant to our topic tonight. Professor Wirth-Nesher has published one book called Call It English, The Languages of Jewish American Literature, and she is also the editor of the Cambridge History of Jewish American Literature. Thanks.
Thank you. I didn't think I would start my talk by saying that I too went to Columbia, but I think we'll have a lot to talk about. But that was 20 years before you were there. But I have stories about that too. Okay, I want to thank Yoav Fromber and Julie Cooper for inviting me to participate and to have the opportunity to respond to what is really a landmark essay. When Frank Foer's essay came out, I also was sending it to people and they were sending it to me. I was also asked today to bring my academic discipline to this discussion, and my discipline is literary studies. So I am going to reflect on one word and one phrase in the sentence right under the title of Foer's article in The Atlantic. Here's the sentence under the title, okay? Anti-Semitism on the right and left threatens to bring to a close an unprecedented period of safety and prosperity for Jewish Americans and demolish the liberal order they helped establish. I'm going to focus on safety and liberal order. Let me say at the outset that I'm in total agreement with Foer in his demarcating a historical period, the post-war golden age, that with hindsight we now see was not the ushering in of a new permanent reality, not at all. And he's calling our attention to the recent clear signs that it is ending. Thank you for that. It's a painful truth, but it's something that we need to face. By bringing literary study to today's discussion, I'm assuming that writers often detect the pulse of their readers' anxieties. And in this case, Jewish American writing demonstrates that the golden age was not as clean a break from the past as the American Jewish community wanted to believe. So first, safety. In his 1959 story, Eli the Fanatic, Philip Roth's character, Eli Peck, reflects on American Jews' newfound safety in post-war suburbia. Quote, "What peace, what incredible peace. Have children ever been so safe in their beds? Never in Rome, never in Greece. Never even did walled cities have it so good. Here, after all, were peace and safety, peace and safety." Roth plants this over-the-top, tongue-in-cheek praise for the wooded suburbia, formerly off-limits for Jews, in the mind of a lawyer enlisted by his fellow Jews to find a legal way to evict other Jews, ultra-Orthodox Holocaust survivors whose flight to safety in suburbia threatens American Jews' newly won access to split-level paradise. As to his wry reference to walled cities as safe spaces, the Jewish experience of walled cities in Europe, after all, was ghettos. He knows what he's doing. Safety for Jews haunted Roth. As late as 1989, he entitled the first chapter of his autobiography, Safe at Home, a play on reaching home plate in baseball, and also recognizing that his home was safe from wars abroad. Quote, "The greatest menace while I was growing up," he wrote, "were the Germans and the Japanese. And the biggest threat at home were the Americans, who oppressed or resisted us or condescended or rigorously excluded us." In 2004, Roth wrote a stunning novel about anti-Semitism, The Plot Against America. As you mentioned, an alternative history where Charles Lindbergh defeats Roosevelt in the US. And then Lindbergh proceeds to institutionalize anti-Semitism, denying safety to Jews. And now, 2 decades later, we recognize Roth's prescience. Many Golden Age writers actually devoted much of their themes to anti-Semitism. You mentioned this too. Laura Hobson's best-selling Gentleman's Agreement portrayed a WASP journalist who decides to pass as a Jew in order to write a series of articles about anti-Semitism. Within days, Phil Green is shocked to discover Jews are passing as Gentiles to keep their jobs. And there's genteel anti-Semitism in his little circle. And among well-known post-war writers in the Golden Age who depicted anti-Semitism in America as a theme were, and this is just a short list of there are many. Saul Bellow in The Victim, where implicit stereotyping becomes brutally explicit. Henry Roth's Mercy of a Root's Dream, where anti-Semitic scars in childhood haunt an aging writer. Arthur Miller in Focus, where an anti-Semite mistaken for a Jew is assaulted by the Christian Front. Alfred Ulrey in Parade, a play about the lynching of Leo Frank. And the last example I'll give is Cynthia Ozick in NPR Yiddish in America. There's a great scene there at the end where an anonymous voice from a receiver in a Manhattan phone booth spouts anti-Semitic slurs. And only 3 years ago, Joshua Cohen was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for the Netanyahus, a book that captures anti-Semitism on American college campuses in the 1950s. There's a lot more to say about that book, but for another time. That same year, Spielberg produced The Fabelmans, a retrospect to 1950s America when he was bullied as a Jew. Now for the second word. For Foer's second endangered concept, the liberal order, more complicated, that made Golden Age possible. Foer rightly traces it back to Horace Callan's concept of cultural pluralism as the ideal American paradigm in place of the melting pot. Callan assumed that ethnicity is defined by descent. I quote him, "We cannot change our grandfathers. So therefore, Jews and other minorities are defined by blood." Foer points out that this model of ethnicity served American Jews very well during the Golden Age, as ethnicity, a hyphenated identity, became a valued aspect of being American. Yet, this match of Jews' aspirations with cultural pluralism wasn't simple. On one hand, Callan's model may indeed be characterized as liberal, okay, in that it validates diversity and treats ethnic identities as equal. But ancestral origin as the basis of ethnic identity denies agency, a basic tenet of liberal society. Identity by descent is inescapable and essentialist. The shift from the melting pot to cultural pluralism meant that minority groups were no longer coerced into abandoning their difference, but the members of those groups were marked as essentially different. So what does this have to do with language? One of the manifestations of cultural pluralism's essentialism was proud, confident public use of the word Jew, as evident in the titles of many literary works during the Golden Age, to name only a few. Alfred Kaysen's New York Jew, Carl Shapiro's Poems of a Jew when he was poet laureate, Ben Katcher's graphic novel, The Jew of New York, Kalischer's Sunday Jews, Leslie Fiedler's Last Jew in America, and I can go on, but I won't. But that isn't the whole story. For the word Jew, as a sound signaling derision and vulnerability, also continued to be invoked by writers during the Golden Age. By the 1990s, cultural pluralism was being replaced in the humanities by critical multiculturalism. It has other words, but that's how it appears in literary studies. A concept based on power relations that repositioned Jews as white, privileged oppressors. Ethnicity has become synonymous with oppression, and Jews no longer qualify as ethnics, and they've been expelled from ethnic studies programs. While essentialism has given way to intersectionality, which restores agency to identity, Jews are the exception. Jews don't have the privilege of naming themselves. Today, they continue to be defined by others who employ the same trope of greed, ruthlessness, and villainous power attributed to Jews in the past. They are once again being defined by who they are essentially. On the far right, as a sinister race passing as white, and on the far left, as whites who have always been unscrupulous. Back to the word Jew. 3 years ago, the Washington Post ran an article with this headline, "Jew isn't a slur." The author reassured readers that you don't have to avoid saying it. To demonstrate the shift from Jew to Jewish, the article traced strategies of avoidance in White House Rosh Hashanah greetings under Trump 2017, the wishes were for Jewish families. 2018, Jewish people. 2019, those observing Rosh Hashanah. And in 2020, Jewish brothers and sisters. This was not true in the past. Other presidents did use the word Jews. Plenty of people, particularly non-Jews today, now avoid the word Jew. According to linguists who research American Jewish language, the word is being avoided. It's being avoided by non-Jews and by Jews alike. One of the most glaring avoidances of the J word occurred in the media coverage of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death. Journalists repeatedly referred to her as the first Jewish person to lie in state. Despite her own declaration in her lifetime, I am a judge born, raised, and proud of being a Jew. In the current climate, some university students are so hesitant to write Jew in their papers that they're asking their instructors for guidance. Can I write it? Well, everyone agrees that when Jew is used as a verb, as in to Jew down, or as an adjective in Jew banker, it's always derogatory. But what about the down? Is it morphing into the J word as it reverts back to a reviled, essentialist stereotype? My last literary example. Here again, Jewish American writers in the Golden Age often detected this revulsion around the word Jew. Hortense Kalischer dramatized anguished avoidance of the word in her remarkable story, Old Stock, which appeared in the New Yorker. Kalischer summed it up this way. It's about a young girl at a Jewish summer resort in the Catskills, and her first encounter with anti-Semitism outside, inside her own family, and maybe inside herself. In Old Stock, the young girl, Hester, and her mother are taken aback one day when a Miss Onderdonk, a Catskill native, complains about the recent influx of all these Jews coming in the summer to this area. Quote, I told Elizabeth Smith she'd rue the day she ever started taking in Jews. And now I'm quoting, the short word Jew soared in an arc across Hester's vision. The mother, realizing that she needs to maintain self-respect for her daughter's sake, responds, I thought you knew we were Hebrews. Hester regards the word Hebrews, quote, as the ultimate refinement that slid out of her mother's soft voice. And she silently prays, please say it, mother. Say Jew. Say Jew. Sensing Hester's distress, the best she can do is to lean forward and say, but we are Jewish. She cannot bring herself to utter the noun. I'm concluding. As we have come to expect, Philip Roth dramatizes Jew as slur during the Golden Age when Eli Peck receives an alarmist phone call from his Gentile neighbor after he has already exchanged clothing with his Holocaust survivor alter ego. In a panicked voice, his non-Jewish neighbor says, Eli, there's a Jew on your lawn. That's me, he replies. Today, when pronouncing the J word has become a litmus test for respect and self-respect, this linguistic squeamishness serves as more evidence for a waning golden age. Just give me a little more. Okay. As we have come to expect, Philip, wait a minute, that's me, I read that, yes, okay, all right. Hold it, yes. Furthermore, October 7th has not only intensified the external threat of anti-Semitism, and here I would really like to get a response to this later, it has also accelerated, I think, the decline of American Jewish experience. That is a golden age among Americans internally, as some progressives publicly identify as Jews, yet do not grieve for the plight of half of the world's Jews here, along with their justified grief for Palestinians. In another prophetic literary work, Here I Am, by Jonathan Safran Foer, Foer describes how American Jews distance themselves emotionally from Israel. This is written in 2016. After a war that nearly destroyed Israel and that met with censure for its actions. In that novel, the Jewish American character Jacob, whose biblical namesake, of course, is Israel, concludes this, that over there was no longer his. And the Israelis' response in the novel to this dispassion is that it is bad for the Jews. Last paragraph. I'll conclude with American Jews' ambivalence about their status in America. Most haven't lost their faith in the US as a safe haven. Yet at the same time, they recognize that it's not immune when it comes to Jew hatred. And the most daring literary expression of this ambivalence is, "What can I do? He was brilliant." Philip Roth's Plot Against America. Written in the shadow of 9/11, Roth, like his readers, he wants to have it both ways. On one hand, he bases his dystopia of a fascist, anti-Semitic America under President Lindbergh on actual history, with a detailed appendix of historical events that proves that this was a plausible scenario. On the other hand, he heavy-handedly manipulates his plot in the finale when suddenly Lindbergh's plane disappears, so that nightmarish counter-history can seamlessly morph back into a happy ending, an American happy ending, Roosevelt's triumph over domestic and foreign fascism. By sleight of hand, Roth replaces anti-Semitic America with the familiar vision of a promised land that Jewish Americans continue to believe in. See, Roth reassures his readers it didn't happen here after all. See, Roth warns his readers it could have, and it can.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we're going to have a response from Professor Eli Lederhendler, who is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at Hebrew University, and a longtime specialist in American Jewish history. And again, Eli has published many books, but I'll just mention two that are of note for this event. One is New York Jews and the Decline of Urban Ethnicity, 1950 to 1970. And the other book that is worth noting in this context is American Jewry, A New History, which he published in 2017. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Franklin, for your article and your wonderful talk. And Hana, thank you. There is an irony of asking two American expatriates to come here and talk about the golden age of American Jewry. We who haven't lived in America as permanent residents for decades. And I will also say, as Hana chose the word Jew, I'll choose the word, or the couplet, golden age, as a fulcrum for a few remarks. First of all, at my stage of life, golden age, Jews, one thinks of a senior community in Florida. I have to take that seriously anytime it's mentioned. But as a Jewish historian, every time I hear golden age, I reach for my pinch of salt and throw it over my shoulder. The last time we Jews had a golden age, it didn't end so well for us. You'll remember Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. Golden ages, we don't have a particularly good experience with in Jewish history. And so I start from that point of skepticism. And also want to thank you, Franklin, for providing a moving target, because you managed to be both pessimistic and optimistic in one talk, which makes it very, very difficult to pin you down. But be that as it may, one of my late colleagues, Aryeh Goren, another American Jewish historian from Hebrew University, he once wrote a trenchant article about the golden decade of American Jewry, and he was speaking of the years from 1945 to 1955. And of course, as a historian and as an expatriate, and as somebody who taught at Columbia, and by the way, I was a student at Columbia in the 70s too. Goren, in that article, basically said, well, everybody thought it was the golden age, but wait a minute. Actually, it was more a continuation of the age of anxiety, more than was given credence to at the time. 1945 What could have been a better year to start a golden decade? Bess Meyerson became the first Jewish Miss America. Hank Greenberg was the champion of the World Series. It was a wonderful year to be an American Jew. Of course, if you blocked out everything else that had happened in the world up until 1945. Nevertheless, it was the genesis of what I think we can place at the core of your Golden Age idea, and that is that with 1945 was born an ideology of American Jewish life. With the destruction of European Jewry, American Jewry emerged virtually unscathed as the mega Jewish community of the world, with the resources and the talent and the motivation to take on the role of a mega Jewish community. And it did so with a great deal of success for decades. Excuse me, can I have my water? Sorry. Thanks a lot. That ideology was going to be central after 1948, when Israel became a sovereign Jewish state, claiming in so many ways to represent the center of the Jewish people, and all of the rest were all of the rest. They were tfutzot, they were galuyot, exiles. American Jewish ideology in the post-1945 era said, no, 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 no. Galut, that's not us. Galut is what happened in Europe. Galut is what happened in the Arab countries. We are not a galut, we are a diaspora. We are Bavel counterpoised to Yerushalayim. We are co-equal, if not more senior, partners in the constellation of post-war Jewry. And as a diaspora, not a galut, as a diaspora, we are at home. We are not in exile, we are at home. We're not a minority. We are a pillar of Americans' way of life. We are a pillar of the Judeo-Christian culture, which was already referred to, which became popular in the 50s as a kind of a slogan or a logo. We are a pillar of American democracy against atheist communism. We are a pillar of religious pluralism. We are a pillar of supporting brotherhood and equality for all. We don't need special protections. We have the Constitution. We're part of the structure and the hegemony that created the United States and led the United States to victory over tyranny in the Second World War, and God willing would do the same in the Cold War. So you don't have to be a minority and you don't have to feel uncomfortable. You can actually revel in being a diaspora community with its own interests, its own vibes, its own writers, comedians, performers, songs, and whatnot. An entire culture based on the idea that America was different. Now, America is different. Let there be no mistake. I'm not one of those people who run around saying that there's an easy or facile analogy between the United States and other countries that we might name. America is very different. One of the big differences, and I say this as a historian, in the 1920s and 30s, countries well established in other parts of the world fell prey internally to their own inner contradictions, going towards the fascist right, going towards Stalinist communism. The idea of a post-World War I New World Order, safe for democracy, that imploded as country after country went the way that we know that they went. And the rest was disaster, not least for us. The United States had all of the same problems that all those other countries had: economic, social, political, you name it, in addition to all the special American problems that most other countries don't have, such as the race issue in the particular American form. But the Americans found a way to go through the entire interwar era and through the 1940s, despite the resurgence of popular and genteel or not so genteel anti-Semitism, because the institutions of American society remained firm. By institutions, I'm talking mainly about the system of justice. And so far as I can see, that hasn't changed. In other words, American Jews felt at home as a diaspora living in a free society, not because there weren't people out there who didn't like Jews. There were always people who didn't like Jews and sometimes even hated Jews. But they lived with this sort of idea that they were comfortably settled because they had full belief in the authority of the Constitution and the American justice system. So much so that they said, well, we don't need to go to battle to make that system work for us. We've already accomplished that. We need to do it on behalf of others. That's hubris. All right, I only have a few minutes, so let me just say one or two other things. We forget sometimes about the years from 1957 to 1968, which saw a spate of synagogue fire bombings across the American South and in the hinterland of America. We forget the teachers' strike in New York City in 1968, which caused me to lose 3 months of my senior year in high school, when the entire strike, how many left? 5? The entire strike situation was infused with an ugly outbreak of anti-Semitism. The post-1967 turn of Black militants and the Black Panthers in particular, but others, not only against Israel, but also against Jews in the United States as being part of the white privileged hierarchy. All of this happened during the Golden Age, and therefore we're entitled to be incredibly skeptical about any nostalgia for any of those days. And I would also suggest that different Jews have different golden ages. The golden age of Yiddish literature in America was over by the time Isaac Bashevis Singer was handed a Nobel Prize for Literature, because even by then, even he was writing everything that he wrote mainly for the English reader. And even if he wrote it in Yiddish, he was writing it in English. So, there is no golden age. Let's not fool ourselves. I do take very seriously the turn of events since October 7th, the terrible, that terrible year and a half that has ensued. We're witnessing a resurgence of the socialism of fools, the famous epithet or bon mot about when Jews are projected as the source of all of the evils of the hierarchical system by people who believe that they are fighting for something progressive. Our war here is going to end. Halavai bimhera b'yameinu. It's going to end. We know that it's going to end. I'm not sure that their war over there is going to end when ours does. And that's troublesome. That's what troubles me. And I don't want to send you back home with a terribly pessimistic oi, 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 but there you have it. Your war is just beginning, I'm afraid. And so we have to be there for you, just as you have to be there for us. We have to be there for each other. I don't want to confuse the severity of the two wars. There is sometimes maybe a penchant in America to think that what they're going through over there is much, much worse than what we're going through here. I don't think that we here would agree with that. It's much, much worse to have somebody try to kill you all the time. But I wouldn't say that what's going on in the United States is merely a matter of name calling or even the avoidance of the word Jew or that sort of thing. Still, I think that it is a worthy contribution of your article to the post-October 7th discussion. The most hated word in Hebrew now, as you know, is konceptia. And I think what you have done for American Jews is to schrei Gewalt konceptia. There has been a konceptia of American Jewish life, and hey, you'd better have another look, because that konceptia has gotten you nowhere, and now you're in big trouble. So by saying, let's look again, let's re-examine the konceptia of the American Jewish golden age, even if we put it in scare quotes, I think you've done us all, and certainly everybody over there, a great service. It's a conception that was long overdue for being overhauled. What may happen, and I don't know, I'm not a futurist, the ideology that I referred to earlier that's set in after 1945, that American Jews are a diaspora, not a galut, because they're not a minority. They are an integral part of American society as such. They are a majority, as it were. That, I think, that part of the conceptia probably needs to be re-examined in a serious way, because when you live as a minority, it changes you. One of my very close friends who teaches at Columbia, she was over here last week, and we discussed this at length, and in fact, we discussed your article as well, and she said what happened was that all of these Jewish parents who are sending their kids to college in the United States now, they sent them off lacking the antibodies to deal with anti-Semitism that their parents and their parents had grown up with as part of their immune system. And these kids and their parents are coming to the fray without antibodies. My friend Rebecca Coburn, you may know her, she said the Jews in America are basically anti-vaxxers. They have failed to provide the basic antibody protection so that their children will be able to cope. So go home and get vaccinated. And part of being vaccinated means taking on the consciousness that being a minority really means being a minority. And it's not an easy task to try to live that way. Nor is it easy to try and live as a majority, as we all know. But that's what we got. Thank you very much.